Bible Worm, reading the Bible with Bible Worm.
Welcome to Bible Worm, getting to the core of the biblical text. I'm Dr. Robert Williamson, Professor of Religious Studies at Hendrix College and Theologian in Residence of Canvas Community in Little Rock, Arkansas.
And I'm Dr. Amy Robertson, Director of Lifelong Learning and Music at Congregation Or Hadash in Sandy Springs, Georgia. We're here every week to discuss the biblical text, both as biblical scholars and as people of faith, one Jewish and one Christian.
This week, we're reading the story of Jesus disrupting temple commerce during the festival of Passover, as told in John 2:13-25. Unlike the other Gospels, which place this story at the end of Jesus' ministry, John places it at the very beginning, just after Jesus' miracle of turning water into wine in Cana. If that story had led us to think that Jesus was going to be all yes, this story puts us squarely into the no. In this case, Jesus' no is to the intersection of worship and business, as Jesus declares, "Do not make my Father's house a house of commerce." But what does it mean that the temple, and by extension our own churches and synagogues, shouldn't conduct business related to worship? Sure, we see how having a church gift shop might be a bit over the top, but travelers need to exchange money, pilgrims need to buy animals for sacrifice, pastors need to feed their families. Perhaps we think Jesus is holding out an idealized view of a future in which money is no longer needed for worship. But here and now, in a world in which money is in fact necessary, perhaps we can at least try to minimize the business of worship, making sure our finances support true worship rather than designing our worship to bring in more business. Thanks for joining us. Hey, Amy, it's Bible Worm time.
Hey, Bobby, what's up?
The story we're reading this week, as you well know, is John chapter 2, verses 13-25, which is the story of Jesus going into the temple on Passover and finding things not the way he is hoping to see them.
That is correct.
So my question for you is
correct.
Have you ever been either on a holiday or into a place of worship or into a place of worship on a holiday and found things not as you think they should be?
I mean, I don't think at the profound level that Jesus felt distressed about.
Never wanted to flip over tables? Yeah.
I have not flipped over any tables nor fashioned weaponry of any kind.
Yeah, that's probably good.
But yeah, sure. I've been in religious services that I'm visiting someone else's congregation and I go in and I'm like, oh, no.
No, that is not the way we do things.
Nope,
yeah.
I don't want to do that. For me, again, it's more lighthearted. It often has to do with either the music.
Mm.
There is a sort of branch of the Jewish world that has organ,
yeah,
really sort of high reform, 1950s America kind of stuff.
Presbyterian worship meets the Jewish community.
Yeah. And that just doesn't. Yeah, it's just so unfamiliar. I don't really know what to do with it, or how the room is set up. Sometimes the arrangement of the room is. I'm very uncomfortable with it.
You like to be in the round or something?
No, sometimes it's in synagogues. In some synagogues, the clergy is standing on the same level as the congregation, and in some synagogues, there's a raised platform.
Yeah.
Where the clergy stands, and I'm much more comfortable. The higher that platform, the less comfortable Amy is.
Yes.
The more the clergy is sort of integrate. My favorite is when the clergy almost feels like it's part of the congregation. My very favorite is when the clergy is actually facing the same direction as the congregation, not
that's
facing
interesting.
us.
Yeah.
Although that's kind of rare. But the other, it's sort of more, I don't know, maybe meaningful thing is some synagogues separate by gender.
Oh, right.
And then also might have a visual block so we can't see each other.
Oh,
and so that already is challenging for me. And then also sometimes the women's side is less, you have a worse view, basically, of the front of the room, and then that, like all these things. Just right. You can you can imagine how I sort of feel about all those things. But what about you, Bobby? You have any deal breakers?
I'm so interested in this idea of the pastor or rabbi being on the same level as the people, because I think something similar. And it says something about one's ecclesiology in my terminology, about what do you think the pastor is or the rabbi is relative to the congregation. And so I'm with you on that. For me, the religious leaders are one of us, and they are leading us in a particular kind of way, but we're all kind of communally together. And so I'm with you there. The thing that has made me want to flip over tables, this might be a little bit on the nose. I've been to a couple of really mega churches that have the band and the whole deal, which I can respect that mode of worship. And, in my little Canvas community, we're guitar and we do that whole thing. Not in that way. It's acoustic guitar, and random people playing drums, which is hey, person in off the street, have a drum. We sort of see how it goes. But anyway, one of these places, and it had a gift shop, and they were selling CDs of the band and books written by the pastor. And something about that to me, it was just I don't know that I feel good about this is a little too on the nose for today's story, I think. But
but I mean, I think I actually love that you're bringing it up, because I think there are real applications for today's worship of the kind of thing that is displeasing.
Yes.
To our protagonist. Yeah.
Well, why don't we see the ways in which Jesus was displeased by reading a little bit. So today's passage is 2:13-25, and I am reading in the Common English Bible. It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. He found in the temple those who were selling cattle, sheep, and doves, as well as those involved in exchanging currency, sitting there. He made a whip from ropes and chased them all out of the temple, including the cattle and the sheep. He scattered the coins and overturned the tables of those who exchanged currency. He said to the dove sellers, "Get these things out of here. Don't make my Father's house a place of business." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Passion for your house consumes me." So there's a few things here that I think will just help us kind of set the stage and understand just what is the context in which we are reading. So the first thing is just Jerusalem at Passover. Can you talk a little bit about the significance of Passover and why Jerusalem?
So ritually speaking, Passover is one of 3 pilgrimage holidays during the course of the year. And so Jews from everywhere, from wherever they live, are supposed to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in order to bring an offering to the temple. The pilgrimage at Passover in particular is so important, so integral to Jewish life, that there's actually on the calendar this little known thing of the second opportunity to go, Passover Sheni, if you were sick or if an emergency came up that prevented you from being able to go, so that you have another opportunity to go, which to me really indicates that it is really important that you go.
So there are reasons why one might miss Passover, but then there's a second Passover, a makeup Passover in case you... In case you need to do that. But I can just only imagine. I mean, at this point, there have been Jews living. It's not just Jews coming from all over Israel. There are Jews living outside of Israel at this point in history. And so people are making long trips. Yes.
To come and make their offering. It really, I would imagine that life was very much shaped by the presence of these pilgrimages and figuring out how to have done enough work and sort of put away enough food or earned enough money so that you can take the time to make these trips 3 times a year, that it really would be an orienting thing to your whole calendar, not just to the couple of weeks when these things happened.
Passover is no longer a pilgrimage holiday, right?
Right.
It's you don't even go to shul on Passover.
You do.
I
mean, there are services that you go for. I mean, Passover is definitely known more as a home holiday because the Seder happens at home. But there are also services on the first and last days.
Yeah. But in the time period that we're reading, it was a pilgrimage holiday, and Jews from all over the world, as you're saying, were meant to come to Jerusalem and to bring a sacrifice for the holiday.
Yeah.
And, Josephus tells us that, you never know with Josephus, like the Jewish historian from the end of the first century, that guy, he was prone to a little bit of exaggeration, but he tells us in Antiquities that there were like 3 million people in Jerusalem for Passover. And so even if you take him as exaggerating by like threefold, there's like 1 million people in this like ancient city that's not designed. And so it is packed full of people from all over the world.
I can't even imagine.
In that context, can you help me think about why they would be selling animals and exchanging coins in the temple?
It seems to me like a thing that really would be needed by the pilgrims.
Yeah.
Are you going to bring the sheep that you're offering from North Africa and walk with it the whole way and hope it doesn't get blemished anywhere along the way because it needs to be a perfect, they wouldn't have the coins of Israel if they didn't live there. These seem like practical things that you could absolutely make a case are facilitating the observance of the holiday.
I think that's really important. And, of course, in the Levitical text and elsewhere, the animals that are offered in the temple are meant to be without blemish. And so if you imagined trying to bring your lamb or a cow or whatever from North Africa or from Babylon all the way to Jerusalem without it, scuffing its toe or whatever, it would be impossible. And so these merchants are, in a very real sense, like making possible the worship in the temple. Now, Josephus also does tell us in Antiquities that the temple officials sometimes sort of exploited the travelers, as people do, right? It's like things are really expensive at the hotel gift shop or in the airport or wherever you've got people traveling who need things, who have no other real options. And so it is possible, I think, to read at some level here that the officials in the temple are taking advantage of people. But I don't know, that doesn't really seem in my mind to explain why Jesus is so upset. He seems to be going beyond like, hey, you've got some, unfair practices you need to tidy up. Yeah. This seems more kind of fundamental.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of what Jesus does, like when he walks in is he makes a whip and chases them out of the temple and then says, get these things out of here. Don't make my Father's house a place of business. That sounds pretty to the core of what's happening. Can you talk to me about how you read Jesus and what he's upset about?
So I'm aware that there is a tradition in some corners of the readership of understanding this to reflect unethical business practices and that it's a critique of that. Certainly, unethical business practices would be forbidden in the Torah all over the place, up and down. I just don't see it in the text. It doesn't say anything about selling the animals at an unfair price or sell it. It doesn't say anything in the text that, to me, suggests that the practices themselves are unethical. What I see is more just Jesus doesn't think any kind of commerce should be mixed in with the practices of the temple. Like that there's just no way to keep that line clean. And so I don't know what he would suggest for the pilgrims, to be honest, but this is not it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Amy. This version of Jesus in the temple is told in the other 3 Gospels, but there's some key differences. And one of them, I think that you're sort of pointing to is like in Mark's version, Jesus refers to, you've turned the temple into a hideout for crooks, which does seem to kind of lean in that direction about there's some kind of unjust practice that's going on here. But you're exactly right. In John's version of the story, Jesus doesn't say that at all. And what he's upset about is just the very fact of business at all. There is a passage that may be referenced here in Zechariah 14:21. It's only in the Greek version. Zechariah 14:21 says, "There will no longer be any merchants in the house of the Lord of heavenly forces on that day." And so there's a sense back in that prophetic text that there is a day a-coming, the day of the Lord, when there's no longer buying and selling. The Hebrew has, there will no longer be any Canaanites, which is, takes you in a whole different direction.
It really takes you in a different direction.
But the Septuagint, the old Greek translation, which is what probably John would have been using, has that reference. And so maybe Jesus is anticipating here some kind of messianic day on which selling no longer takes place in the temple. And so he's enacting that in this moment.
That's an interesting option to me, because it's not necessarily saying this never should have been happening, but is saying things are changing at this moment. We have reached a different time in history and the rules have changed, which that makes good sense to me. I
like that a lot. I still wonder, what Jesus does right here would have shut down Passover.
Yeah.
I think if he really successfully got rid of all of the merchants in the temple, then nobody has anything to offer. And, maybe they would have gotten it up and running again.
Yes.
But what he's doing here is not simply tweaking the practice, but saying this is not the way anymore. Yes. I like where you're headed there, of not necessarily a critique of the long sweep of the practice, but saying we are now at an inflection point in time where this practice is no longer necessary. The other thing that is interesting here to me is the use of house. You miss it a little bit in the CEB, because the CEB says, "Don't make my Father's house a place of business" in verse 16. But the Greek actually says, "Don't make my Father's house a house of business." And so we've got house, Father's house, house of business. And then the quotation that comes there from Psalm 69 is zeal for, or in the CEB, passion for your house consumes me. And so I'm just curious about, do you see any connections in this sort of houseness? My Father's house, house of business, zeal for your house.
Yeah.
How do you put that together?
Yeah. I, again, am grateful for that footnotes in my Jewish annotated New Testament that pointed out what you have just pointed out, that what is translated in the NRSV as marketplace is literally house of market.
Yeah.
Which is contrasted with house of my father.
The Greek there is emporium, which I like.
That's really funny.
You only hear emporium now in places
I want to
that
sing
are
you an old commercial now for the food emporium. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. But it does, for me, that really, it makes it very pointed to say those things are in conflict with each other.
Yeah.
Those things can't occupy the same space.
Yeah.
The market, and the house of market and the house of my father. The psalm you're referring to, I looked over before we started our conversation today, and it's one of these psalms that is sort of a person who, because of their devotion to God and to God's house in particular, to the temple in particular, is, doesn't have a lot of friends. Devotion does not make him popular among people. And so that seemed like I can imagine that people were displeased at Jesus's behavior here, because as you're saying, this is basically making it impossible for them to celebrate Passover in the way that they have been doing and the way they know how to do. And so a lot of good and faithful people who have been traveling for days or weeks to get there are not going to be this was not a small thing that Jesus did. And so I would imagine it would indeed upset people around him.
The bigger issue that you're pointing to is what Jesus seems to be doing here is saying that there should not be commerce in the temple,
Mm-hmm.
even though it is necessary to proper worship.
Because of the constraints of the world as it is. Like if people didn't have to make such pilgrimages, or if they didn't have to worry about the well-being of their animals during the pilgrimage, or something like that. Like I can't imagine, as you're saying, I can't imagine any other way that they would be able to worship in the way that they understand themselves to be commanded to worship. But Jesus is saying that whole thing is changing.
Amy, one of the things that bugs me about this version of this story is the whip. Like, I kind of wish Jesus would just be like, hey guys, get out of here.
Y'all can't do this.
He fashioned a whip.
Yeah.
I don't really quite know what to make of that. Do you make anything of that? Like, he's pretty mad.
Yeah.
Or just trying to get their attention.
Jesus behaves in a pretty explosive way here.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no conversation, there's no teaching, there's no, it's just, throwing over their tables.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of picturing the whip as sort of driving the animals out.
Not whipping the money changers.
I guess. No. Yeah. I mean, I'm picturing it as a way to like, both of these behaviors as a way to like very abruptly shut things down and make it impossible for them to resume. Like once the animals are driven out, the game's over. They can't, they would have to get all the animals back. I don't know. This is just one of those passages that to me, like, it's not, I don't know. Something abrupt had to happen, and this was a way to make it happen. And there is like violence in the act, but I don't see it as violence against people.
Right.
Or I don't know if this is a overly generous reading. I don't read him as whipping the animals, just sort of like, you like whip near and right, you snap it so they are afraid and get out really quickly.
Yeah, I think that's
sort of what I'm
hiya or whatever.
Yeah,
like,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I'm picturing here. So like alarming and abrupt and chaos inducing and all of those things. I think a couple years ago we discussed, I read a very harsh critique from someone in the Jewish community, I think, of this story and how I mean, yes, this is massively disruptive. I think that's the point of the story, but I don't read it as like harming people or animals' bodies.
That's good. I appreciate that. The implications of this, I mean, we've already just talked about this, but the implications of this statement that Jesus makes, don't make my Father's house a place of business. Like, that's for real. Like I'm thinking of the number of times that we worry about things that we say and do as a faith community because of what the people who give the money will think, or because of the implications it might have for our tax benefits from the government.
Yes.
Or like the number of constraints that we feel about money. And like, in some ways, this passage would be easier if it was about the corrupt use of money in worship.
Yes.
This is taking that, like it's taking Amos's critique of like, don't exploit the poor and then come to worship.
Yes.
And it's just saying commerce and worship do not belong together.
Almost, maybe I'm overreading here, but it's almost like once you have mixed those things in to your systems of worship, like there's just no way for it not to corrupt the worship.
This takes my little snarky observation about a gift shop in the megachurch, and it makes it hit closer to home.
Yeah.
Because, even like drawing a salary as a church professional.
I know. No, I mean, it really does feel to me like a hope for the messianic time.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how to run. I joke with my community all the time, like we unfortunately cannot run on spiritual dollars. And man, do I wish we could.
Yes.
But there are actual bills to pay. And at least
Yes.
in this iteration or era, there are salaries to pay.
Yes.
I don't know if that's good or bad. I don't know how to opt out of that system. But the fact that we have to pay our bills, even if we keep them as low as we can, yeah, it does drive decisions.
Yes.
I wish it didn't. And I don't know how to get out of it.
I had a little church for a few years that nobody was getting paid to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And it really was very freeing in that sense. But also, we met in somebody else's building and somebody else bought snacks for us. And we became very dependent. And there was still some commerce that was happening kind of around. And for a little while, I had a friend who had been formerly homeless, and she was coming in and making coffee and setting up and things. And because we didn't pay anybody, she was not getting paid.
Yeah.
And then one of my other homeless friends said something like, having her volunteer out of the goodness of her heart is exploitation.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, you are not wrong about that, my friend.
Yeah.
And so we went back, so we started paying her. And so it
is not
it's really hard.
It is not, you're exactly right. As
sustain.
long as we are living in the systems we're living in where there is an economy and people do need money and things do cost, I don't know how to totally separate communal worship from those systems. And it sounds great. I hope we can do that someday.
Yeah. So your thought is that Jesus is somehow enacting here a future hope for an eschatological time that is not realizable in the present.
That's how I feel about it. But if you can make a case that it is realizable, I would love to know how to do that.
Well, I mean, thinking eschatologically is always a little bit of the sort of inbreaking and foretaste kind of idea.
Yeah.
That I will agree completely that it is not fully realizable.
But we should be stretching in that direction.
Maybe so.
Yeah.
Because then people will say oh, well, he never thought we could do it until, the second coming.
Yeah.
And that lets us off the hook. And I think that's very tempting.
Yeah.
And so to say he probably didn't think it was sustainable, but nonetheless a goal to be approximated.
Right. And how much can we
that.
minimize that stuff and keep it out of our decision making?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Julie Holm. I'm the pastor of a small rural community in the UCC and the ELCA, the Brush Valley Fusion of Faith. I was an early Patreon supporter because I loved the podcasts on the Narrative Lectionary, but this year I became a Bible study and liturgy supporter. I'm part-time, and I love that I don't have to spend hours preparing for our Bible study every week. Plus, my group just loves Bobby's Bible studies. The liturgy also gives me a real heads up on putting a worship service together, which I appreciate as a part-time pastor. Amy's responses, both as a deep Bible scholar of her scriptures and as a novice to the Christian scriptures, deeply inform new ways of looking at scripture, and I really appreciate that. I love Bible Worm, and I'm so glad to support it.
Okay, I'll pick up then in verse 18. Then the Jewish leaders asked him, "By what authority are you doing these things? What miraculous sign will you show us?" Jesus answered, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up." The Jewish leaders replied, "It took 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But the temple Jesus was talking about was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered what he had said, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. Amy, the Jewish leaders ask 2 questions, and I struggle to understand the connection between them. The one is, by what authority are you doing these things? And the other is, what miraculous sign will you show us? Can you just help me think about why are they asking those 2 questions in particular?
Yes, and I would like to ask maybe a translational question. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the NRSV, And verse 18 only has the sign. It doesn't have the authority.
Oh, you're right. You are totally right. The Greek, there's only one question here. What sign will you show us? I don't know what the CEB is doing. Oftentimes there's a footnote or something, or I will come across it in a commentary, but you're totally right. In the Greek, that's not there. So they only ask one question. What sign will you show us?
I mean, my understanding of that asking for a sign is sort of like, how can you demonstrate to us that you are not just some dude who's wrecking things? Like,
Yeah.
Like anyone could come into any space and overturn the tables and like create chaos. And so they want to know like how can you show us that you are different from someone who's just, looking to cause trouble?
Jesus' response is, destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll raise it up.
Mm-hmm.
So they say, what sign are you going to show us? And he's like, this is my sign. Destroy it and in 3 days. And we have in some sense been already talking about destruction of the temple, not as like the buildings are going to fall down, but as shutting down the system by which the temple works. And he's saying, I will tear it down and restore it. Their response is sort of at a literal level, which, I mean, as it probably would be. It took 46 years to build this temple. You're going to raise it up in 3 days?
The way, I don't know, what I sort of read into their question is, I don't know if they're understanding this literally, like, I'll give you a sign, but it involves you destroying the temple.
Yeah, yeah.
So, like, you kind of have to believe him before the sign can come.
Yeah.
And what I read in their question is that they're not willing to try.
Sure.
Like that you just put the...
Yeah.
Yeah, this took us 50 years, 46 years to build this place. We're not... Well, we're curious about who you are. We're not that curious.
Yeah. That's really interesting, Amy. That reminds me a little bit of some conversations we've been having this year. The one that's coming to mind, which seems like it comes to my mind often recently, is that passage in Exodus 16 about the manna and the like, if you want to see God's provision, you have to turn your back to Egypt and look into the wilderness. And so here, if you want to see what God can do, you have to be willing to tear down the things you have been building.
Yeah.
And of course they're not willing to do it. And I'm not willing to do it either,
Right. Right. You have to tear down this thing you've worked for, this thing that has a system that you understand.
Yeah.
And again, like a system that, as far as they understand it, this is what God wants them to be doing.
Yeah.
And so this is just some guy who walked in. He could be evil.
Yeah.
They don't know who this guy is, but like if you imagine that statement coming from a devilish person instead of from Jesus, like, tear this down and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. You could imagine how the story goes. They tore it down and then that was it. Like, they tore down their own temple.
Yeah, that took a turn. That's like, the gingerbread man riding on the fox's back across the river.
I mean, it's really like a faith question. Like, do they believe in him before he can offer the sign?
Yeah.
Or not?
Even if you read this as like you totally trust that that Jesus is who he says he is, or who this gospel presents him as, there's still a huge risk in there.
There's a huge risk.
To say we've got to tear down everything that we've been doing and trusting that it can be rebuilt in a way we do not understand, that seems impossible to us. Are you going to do it or not? And, to me, this is like, do you trust that God will lead you through the wilderness, or do you want to go back to the system in Egypt? It's a very similar question.
That's right.
Even absent the issue of like, is Jesus really who he says he is? Even how much more so, right? If you also have that question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's right. And they really are sort of at the beginning of their relationship with God in that manna text. And so, are you gonna put your faith here?
Yeah.
In this new relationship or not?
Yeah. Amy, there's two things just historically speaking that are rattling around in my head. One of them is that Herod the Great, who was king of Judea in the time of Jesus or right before Jesus was a builder, and he took a whole lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of power to rebuild the temple. And so the temple that Herod constructed was this enormous complex, really profoundly amazing. And so this is the temple that we're talking about, is Herod's temple, which was a feat of ancient, construction. And so not just a little structure, but one of the wonders of the world. The other is that in the time of Jesus, when the narrative is taking place, the temple would have been standing. But in the time of John, when he's writing the temple actually has been destroyed. And I go back and forth about whether we should read that. Do I want to read this narratively, like Jesus is standing in the temple? Or do I want to read this historically as John's community has actually witnessed the temple being destroyed as they are hearing this? Does that stir up anything for you?
I mean, yeah, I don't know if I have anything super smart to say about it, but I think the fact that this text straddles that incredibly important historical moment, the loss of the temple, the loss of the second temple, I don't know how you could not read that. If all the readers of John's text are living in a time when the temple has already been destroyed, it does read really differently.
Because when you read it the way we have been, as in narrative time, it reads as we've got this perfectly good system that has been working for a long time, and you're going to disrupt it. When you read it as being written in the 80s or 90s, you have a temple that can't function because the Romans destroyed it. And then the question that both the early Christian community and then the Jewish community that is going to take shape after the temple, the one that doesn't have a temple system anymore, are both trying to figure out, how do you be faithful to the God of the Bible when there is no temple? And so in some sense, this text is solving a problem for the historical community.
Yeah.
Even when it seems to be creating one for the narrative community.
That's fascinating. But I think that's exactly right. Yes. They're saying this was already coming down the pike.
Yeah.
And this is how it was meant to be.
Yeah.
And they just couldn't get on board with it yet.
Yes. So by the time the gospel is being written, this problem will have been forced on everybody.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
John then tells us, kind of as an aside, the temple Jesus was talking about was his body.
I was so disappointed because I thought I was so smart when I was like, ooh, I know what he's talking about. And then John said it, and I was like, oh, fine. I don't get any credit.
It is so interesting that he chooses to tell us here because sometimes he doesn't tell us.
It's a little slow in the uptake. Yeah. Yeah.
It's also interesting because he goes on to say that the disciples were slow on the uptake a little bit, right? They didn't understand what was happening until a couple years later when Jesus dies and is resurrected. And they're like, oh, that's what he was talking about.
I mean, that's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just think that's an interesting, that claim there is, the people who were experiencing the events in real time, at least as they are narrated in John, did not fully understand what they were seeing or hearing or experiencing until the resurrection.
Yeah.
And that event has to be read back to understand what's happening. So you really could not understand what Jesus was saying until later.
Bobby, the way you made me say that, actually, maybe I just have my mind on the Exodus now because you brought it up a moment ago, but has me thinking about the question that my community often asks, which is why do we have to have the plagues? Why did we have to go through all that horror and violence? Couldn't God just have, whipped them out and been fine? And I don't have the perfect answer, but the most compelling answer I've heard is that it wasn't that they needed that to happen. It was that future generations needed that story.
Yes.
And the huge power of it in order to be it was for the future.
Yeah.
And sort of this is the same thing. The people who are there are not they can't understand it in that moment. But the future and the past sort of intermingle in a way that will create the next thing.
Yeah.
It's not quite linear.
This idea that Jesus's body is going to be the temple reminds me of that conversation we had a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the prologue, and it said the Word became flesh and dwelt among them. And we talked about how that word for dwelt, skenoi, is the same word that's used for the tabernacle.
Yeah.
And so he tabernacled among them.
Mm-hmm.
And so this whole idea that like the temple is the like solidified version of the tabernacle, and now Jesus is an embodied something related to the tabernacle. And so this whole year we've had this kind of like the tent that moves in the wilderness, the solidified temple that Solomon built, now going to be torn down. Now it's in a body.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm painted. I just opened up a field of inquiry for you that I invite you to wander into in whatever way you find fit.
I mean, I kind of love thinking about the diversity of ways that God's presence can be with us in a particularly concentrated way, in a particularly concentrated space, and that have different kinds of parameters around them. You know, like there's the tabernacle is a space where lots of people can go, and it moves, and it's, you know, temporary, and that the temple has its I feel like they have their pros and cons. I don't know. I'm sure that's a very heretical thing to say. But the idea of God's presence being in the temple and then God's presence being in a human body, it makes me reflect on sort of the miracle of the human body and what it can do in the world, like what it means for God's presence to be in a body and what a body can do that a space can't do. And, you know, while that is a singular thing in the Christian story, it does make me think a lot about the powers that we have by virtue of the fact that we are in these animate bodies. And, you know, I don't know. That's an interesting thing for me to reflect on.
I like that a lot. One of the things you're making me think about is, you know, the Christian community, and Paul in particular is going to then go on to talk about the early gathering of believers as the body of Christ. And so it sort of moves from like the singular body of the fleshly Jesus to the spiritual body of the community that gathers. In the Jewish tradition, I'm thinking about the Dead Sea Scrolls here. They have a similar concept that, you know, that the Dead Sea sectarians were anti-Jerusalem temple, thought it was being practiced incorrectly. And so one of the ideas they developed is that their gathering was the legitimate temple, even though there was no building involved. Does that idea make its way into rabbinic Judaism as well, that the gathering is the temple?
That's such a good question. And I don't have a proper answer. I want to do some research for you. Certainly that idea makes it into Jewish thought and thinking, but I don't know at what point in history. Maybe you know.
I don't.
Yeah, this is a familiar idea, and it comes up in our congregational life with some frequency, but I don't know whether the rabbis were there or.
Yeah,
I actually would imagine that they probably were, because they're writing as like exactly in this time period. Like the temple is gone, and we're going to have to figure out what that means for our ways of interacting with God's presence and how we can have that sense of intimacy. So I would imagine yes.
Kind of what I'm grappling around a little bit here is this idea that sort of leans in two directions. One is that there's a singularity in Jesus, who is now the temple, he himself, where God's presence is in some kind of way, that God's presence has been in the temple. But it also gestures beyond that to this idea that you and I are talking about now, about the gathered people of faith become the temple, absent the structure, absent the building, absent the commerce. And this is actually one way to kind of take this whole idea, is that the people, like the presence of God can be in the people, with the people, even when there's no structure built up around it, like at all. And my tradition gets there in one kind of a way, and your tradition gets there in another kind of way, but we all get there.
Yeah.
Okay, this story concludes beginning in verse 23. While Jesus was in Jerusalem for the Passover festival, many believed in his name because they saw the miraculous signs that he did. But Jesus didn't trust himself to them because he knew all people. He didn't need anyone to tell him about human nature, for he knew what human nature was. So the first statement here is people believed in him because of miraculous signs that he did. I'm reading this as miraculous signs, not what he's just done.
That's what I'm assuming.
Is that how you read it too?
He did some other stuff. They're just not going to tell us what. But yes, they saw something. It's sort of just like the people in the temple said, what sign are you going to give us? And he didn't really give one.
Right.
But there were some other ones elsewhere that were convincing to people.
Do you remember the sign at Cana with the churning water into wine? The disciples saw it and the stewards knew it, but nobody else really did. And so the disciples have believed in that story. And now here we seem to have Jesus doing some other kinds of signs, and then more people are gathering around his name because of the signs. And this issue of like people believing because of signs and whether that's a good thing or whether that's sort of annoying to Jesus, that people need signs in order to believe, like that's going to keep coming back to us in the weeks ahead. What I'm really interested in here, though, is they believed in him, but he didn't trust himself to them. Yeah. And the verb there in Greek is the same verb.
I was going to ask if it's the same verb, because when I try to, I have this game in my head where I try to project it back into Hebrew, which is stupid because it's not Hebrew. But I wondered if they were the same verb.
Yeah. So the way that it kind of, like a good translation is, they trusted in him. He did not trust himself to them. And so that parallelism with the in there, like he did not. Can you talk a little bit about how you understand what's happening there?
It's sad.
Yeah.
I mean, it's also really real because, we know how this story is going to end. But it makes me think about the ways in which, in the early days of the covenant of Israel, like there was certainly not equality, but there was a sense that like God is going to keep God's part of the covenant, and Israel is going to, the people are going to keep their part of the covenant, and that's how the whole thing is set up. Like there's a kind of mutuality about it, not equality, but a mutuality. And here it seems like there's not a mutuality, and I both understand that. And also feel like a great loss in that.
Yeah.
How do you think about it?
I love where you're going with that, Amy. So because there is this minor key all the way through the biblical text that God desires covenant, and the people often desire covenant, but they can't live up to it. And we see this, all the way from the beginning. And I appreciate you pointing us to the passion narrative, even in this gospel, where Jesus' closest followers are going to likewise not be able to live up to it. And so there is this sort of desire for mutuality, and God and now Jesus are kind of perpetually let down. That is sad. I've never quite said it that way to myself, but it is sad. And yet God in Hebrew scripture and Jesus in this text remain faithful to the covenant, even though they know that the people are never going to quite be able to live up to it. And that is really kind of beautiful and profound, even while it is sad.
What do you think it means then when it says that Jesus doesn't entrust himself to the people?
I just read it as Jesus knows that he can't rely on them. Yeah. And that at some point, no matter how excited they may be about him and how much they might be believing in him right now because of his miracles, that humans are fickle and our wills are frail, and we're going to let him down at some point. And so he just kind of prepared himself for that. I don't quite know. Oftentimes in my community, there will be people who have been hurt by people who are close to them. Yeah. And we talk about like, what does forgiveness and relationship look like in the future? And one way of thinking about that is you can restore a relationship with a person, but you can never like trust yourself over to them in quite the same way. You need to protect yourself a little bit, not be in a vulnerable position with them. And so I think maybe we read Jesus a little bit that way here. It feels different to me for like when I read that about God sort of abstractly in the Hebrew scripture, it's not as poignant to me as it is right here when Jesus has a body, and I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, that would be such a sad and lonely life.
Yeah.
But it's also true of God in the Hebrew scriptures. It's just that God's not walking around in a body, so I feel it differently.
Yeah. I think that's right. And maybe we should feel it differently.
Yeah. This line, he didn't need anyone to tell him about human nature, is so interesting to me. It reminds me of, you often will raise this sort of, especially when we're talking about like Genesis and God is figuring out how to be in relationship with humans and like constantly
God
like having
knows
to
a lot
redirect.
now. Yeah.
And now that God is a human in the telling of John, like now it's like, oh yeah, no, I understand what that's like. I don't need anybody to tell me about it anymore.
Oh, that's so interesting. I don't know why I read it this way, but I imagined, this is like, the early Trinitarian theology question of what exactly is happening inside Jesus.
You could read it the other way too, for sure.
Yeah, that he knows these things because he also has the mind of God in some way.
Yeah.
But it is, God, that just makes it even more sort of twisted if it's like he knows what humans are like because he's also human, but he's also, he does not have an easy job.
He does not have an easy job. That is true. With that Trinitarian thing, like I think you can walk that path in both directions. And, there are theologians like Jürgen Moltmann is one that I'm thinking of that talks about how the crucified Christ takes that experience of abandonment and crucifixion up into the divine. And so like the flow goes that way, even as the flow comes divine to human, it also goes human to divine. And so I think there's an opening there for us to ponder.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Amy, we have had occasion to make a couple of references to the fact that this story appears in the other Gospels as well. There are a couple of differences, one of which we've already noticed about the like den of robbers in the synoptics, but not here. The other kind of striking difference is in the other Gospels, this event comes at the very end of Jesus's life as the beginning of the last week of his life, at the end of which, of course, he's going to be crucified. In John's Gospel, this is the second real thing that Jesus has done since he's gathered his disciples. The first was the wedding at Cana, and now this story. There's going to be 2 more Passovers in the Gospel of John, one in chapter 6 around the feeding of the 5,000, and then the one at the end of his life. And so we are, in John's narrative, 2 years ahead of the crucifixion. And so I'm just curious, when you think about the shift in the narrative story of Jesus to the beginning instead of the end, do you read any significance into that? Does it open up anything for you?
It does. It feels really different. And I don't know if I can put very smart words around what feels different. I mean, one thing that I noticed was just a couple verses ago, he didn't really want to do this thing. And then what he did was pretty subtle. He did not draw any attention. A couple of people knew what happened, but it was really kind of on the down low.
Yeah.
And this is not a subtle act. And it's also not a miraculous act. Like he goes in and does something that any person could walk in and do that.
Yeah.
It feels very bold and very like, I don't know. He said, it's not my time, but then he was like, all right, I guess it is my time.
I guess it is now. Yeah.
I know. It feels like really stepping boldly into having a lot of eyes on you and really upsetting the proverbial apple cart. Like it really is like the apple cart.
Yeah.
And in a way that makes that last thing we were talking about as that he knows he can't trust it. It sort of emphasizes to me the tension between him and the community of people around him. Like he kind of starts off by upsetting a whole bunch of people. And then he has other people following him, but he doesn't really trust them either.
Yes.
Yeah, I feel like he's taken a big step. Gosh, I was going to say away from the human community, but I think that's not quite right. But a big step. I can't finish that sentence. Do you know what I'm trying to say? Like,
I mean, the way I finished your sentence was he took a step into the fray, which I'm not sure is exactly what you mean, but into the humanness of the human and all the complexities that involves, like people following him, but imprecisely, and people opposing him and trying to, nobody's trying to hurt him here, it seems like, but you can kind of
You
feel
can imagine that's not far down the line if this is how you're going to behave.
Yeah.
But that kind of bold action without concern about the human consequences of that action.
Yeah. The gestures forward in this text, like we talk about the crucifixion in this text, like the disciples, like, oh yeah, they're going to remember this 2 years from now. And so the text is clearly wanting us to think about the end of Jesus's life here as well. And so the connections across. Mm-hmm. The other thing that's just occurring to me is this phrase, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, which we've seen a couple of times now. And then Passover, like all of these, this Passover kind of is becoming this pervasive underlying framework for reading and understanding the Gospel of John. And something about the lamb is now in the temple disrupting Passover is just really interesting. I don't quite know where that touches the ground, but it's kind of grabbed my attention. The other thing here, Amy, is if we read this in light, as you were doing a minute ago, of the wedding at Cana, Jesus's first two kind of acts here in John chapter 2 are very different from one another.
Yes. Yeah.
The one was private. It was subtle, as you're saying. It was about generosity upon generosity, grace upon grace, and like creating plenty in a context where it wasn't even really like necessary for there to be plenty, just, enjoying a wedding. Mm-hmm. And then now we have this sort of public, critical, prophetic act. And they come right together. And so it's like from the very beginning, you've got these two things held together.
I love the way you said that, because it makes me think like the first one is this sort of big yes. And the second one is a big no. So if you thought from the first story that this is just going to be a story of yes, it's not just going to be a story of yes.
And the yes is directed to this kind of private, personal, family affair. And the no is toward some kind of official religious practice that is highly structured and in the established way of things. And that's going to carry us on through. So, we have dug up a lot of possibilities in this text that are gesturing in some really different and pretty profound directions. So I'm curious, as you're reading this text today, thinking about where it touches the ground in our world, what are you thinking?
Bobby, I am back in this conversation we were having sort of towards the beginning about what it is to either be a leader in a religious community or really just participate in a religious community that is of the world that we are in, and not sort of like shoot ourselves in the foot, so to speak.
Right.
Without being so beholden to sort of economic and commercial realities that we get in our own way, shooting ourselves in the foot and the other foot. Like, it is a really difficult balance. And on the one hand, I want to say, the very fact that they had animals available in the temple for people who were traveling from afar seems like it could, like, that's when we talk about like we need to make things accessible and we need to cover our expenses and we need to, be aware of what people's real like lived experiences are. The reality is, if this is a silly example, but for Friday night services, if your service starts at 6:30, how are people going to have dinner? Like, should we be thinking about that? Should we be selling dinner before? Like, what, like those kinds of things, like that's real. And I don't think that we should stop thinking about those things. But I do think that we need to sort of constantly be asking ourselves, like, for what purpose do we exist? And at what point are we perpetuating our own business model?
Yeah.
And at what point is it like, this is the best way that we understand to live our mission? And it is integrated in our real, embodied, practical lives in the commercial reality we live in, but it's not driven by that. And I just wonder what questions we can ask, certainly of ourselves as leaders in that way. I mean, it makes me uncomfortable sometimes that I draw a salary from
Sure.
the world of Jewish practice and learning. And I wish I had another job and could do this for fun, but I don't. But I wonder how we can talk with our congregations about tipping the scales in whatever way we can towards anything that can help us from becoming beholden to commerce and economy and things that are not the reason we exist.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't have a great answer to that. I just think it's a good question to ask and re-ask and re-ask of ourselves and our communities.
I'm there with you, Amy, and I think that's such an important line of thinking. And, as somebody who's married to a church pastor, and so whose retirement depends upon the business model that is the church, like I'm invested in that issue. And also, I do think this text is raising those kinds of questions for us. And this thing that Jesus says about "do not make my Father's house a house of emporium," I think that's such a striking way to say it. And just even, Jesus, as we were saying, is not trying to tweak the business model here. He's trying to do something profoundly other. But even if we can think about it as tweaks of the business model, as you were saying, is the house of Godness the first question and not the last one that we ask? It is so easy to lose track of what is this place? How is this about God and worship and not about, the bottom line, as it so often can be? The connection, this, Jesus's body becomes the place of worship here. It is the temple. And so when you think about what has Jesus's body been doing, it's pulling me back to that Cana story that we talked about last week. Whereas the body of Jesus is about grace upon grace and plenty and relationship and celebration. And it's only when the body of Jesus comes into contact with the established religion that it becomes prophetic. And so I'm wanting to reach back to last week a little bit and to say, at the core, it is about the plenty for all and the celebration and doing things on behalf of the community that draw us all together and closer to God. And the sort of business model around it is something we need not to undermine, because we live in the world, not in the Messianic age, but something we need to be willing to question and revise. The other thing that's sort of catching my attention, in addition to where you were leading us, is this last part about they believed in him, but he didn't trust them. And, it's easy to read that about somebody else, but when you read it about us, right? This is the long story of the sweep of the Bible.
Yeah.
From Genesis to the disciples at the crucifixion, is that people are never fully reliable. And so I'm not quite sure where that lands me, but it invites me into a conversation about me and my community and both the ways in which we trust in Jesus, and the ways we trust in God, but also the question of whether we are trustworthy. And are there ways that we can strive? It's human nature. It says it right here that we're never going to be able to be completely trustworthy. But are there ways that we can demonstrate our trustworthiness and try to be worthy of the trust that God places in us, or that Jesus would place in us? Are there ways that we can try to show and demonstrate that we are partners in the covenant, so that Jesus's presence, in our body, as a corporate body of believers, is justified? And oftentimes it's easy to kind of point out the ways in which we fail in that. The church is full of failures. And so for us to think about, well, how can we be more than that? How can we be other than that? How can we be worthy of the trust that has been entrusted to us? I think is a good place for us to be also.
Yeah, I love that. We can be more than that. That's true, but can we be more than that?
This sort of like thing you were gesturing to about, we're talking about a foretaste or an inbreaking of an eschatological age. And there will be a time in which God's reign is fully realized, and then we will be able to do that. And in the meantime, we have to figure out how to do the best we can given the imperial darkness that we find ourselves in. Speaking of imperial darkness, next week we're going to be in John 3, 1-21, which is the story of Nicodemus, who is a Jewish leader who is sort of in this established religion realm, who gets curious about Jesus. He actually becomes a really interesting character across the Gospel of John. So we'll meet him next week.
All right. I look forward to it.
Me too, Amy. Thanks for this conversation. I'll see you next time.
I'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of Bible Worm. If you've enjoyed this free podcast, we hope you'll help us keep it going by joining our Patreon for as little as $4 per month. You can also sign up for other goodies like early access, video lectures, weekly liturgies, and more. Visit patreon.com/BibleWorm podcast for details.
Bible Worm is produced and edited by Bobby Williamson. Our theme song is sung by Colin Bagby, and our theme music is The World at Large by Dano Songs. Many thanks to all our Patreon supporters for helping make this podcast possible.
Join us next week when we'll read John 3, 1-21, the story of Nicodemus coming to Jesus by night. Until then, keep on digging.